She stole that uniform! My father screamed across the packed courtroom, his finger trembling with pure rage as he demanded the judge strip me of my inheritance, my home, and my dignity. My stepmother smirked beside him, convinced they had finally backed me into a corner. But as my attorney stepped forward and handed the bench a sealed dispatch straight from the Pentagon stamped urgent, the entire room went dead silent. The judge opened the file, read a single line, removed his glasses, and slowly stood up. He looked directly at my father and said, "Court is adjourned. Federal officers are waiting outside for you, Mr. Turner." My father's face drained of all color, his confidence shattering in a single second. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my journey has reached. My name is Abigail Turner, and at 46 years old, I thought I had faced the toughest battles life could throw at me. But sitting in that cold, oak-paneled courtroom, listening to my own father try to tear me down, proved me wrong. My father, Richard Turner, stood at the plaintiff's table, his voice booming across the gallery with absolute malice. "She stole that uniform," he shouted, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at me. Beside him sat my stepmother, Evelyn, wearing a triumphantly cruel smirk. For months, they had plotted to erase me from my mother's legacy. When my mother passed, Richard and Evelyn moved swiftly, seizing her estate, taking control of the family holdings, and attempting to strip me of everything I owned. To justify their greed, Richard was now claiming before a judge that I was a fraud, that I had abandoned the family decades ago, falsified my military credentials, and illegally worn the uniform of a decorated service member just to claim an inheritance I didn't deserve. He wanted me penniless, disgraced, and locked away. He believed his money and local influence made him untouchable. What he didn't realize was that 20 years of active duty don't just teach you how to fight on a battlefield, they teach you how to let your enemy walk right into their own trap. He thought he was delivering the final blow, completely unaware of the document my attorney was holding in his briefcase. To understand how my father ended up screaming in a courtroom, you have to understand the shadow I grew up under. Richard Turner was a man obsessed with control. In our household, every dollar was tracked, every decision was audited, and every voice was silenced. Except his. My mother, Margaret, had been a strong-willed woman with a proud history of military service, but years of Richard's subtle manipulation had slowly worn her down. He resented her past, he resented her independence, and most of all, he resented that her personal assets were locked in a trust he couldn't touch. As I grew older, I became the target of that same rigid control. Richard had my entire life mapped out. I was supposed to stay local, work in his logistics business, and remain under his thumb forever. But I carried my mother's blood. When I turned 26, after watching him slowly strip away her independence, I made a choice that fractured our family forever. Without telling Richard, I walked into a recruiting office and enlisted. The night I packed my bags, my father didn't offer a blessing or a tearful goodbye. He stood in the doorway and told me I was no longer his daughter. He claimed I was throwing my life away and warned me never to return. For the next 2 decades, I built a life far away from his reach, rising through the ranks and taking on assignments I couldn't even discuss with family. I thought leaving would protect me from his greed, but I didn't realize that Richard was simply playing a very long game, waiting for the right moment to claim what was never his. When news reached me overseas that my mother's health was failing, I requested immediate emergency leave. But by the time my transport landed, it was already too late. I arrived home not to a grieving household, but to an orchestrated takeover. My mother had passed away just 3 days prior, and Richard hadn't even bothered to call me. Walking into my childhood home felt like entering a battleground. Richard had already replaced my mother's belongings, and standing beside him was Evelyn. a woman half his age who looked at me not as a grieving daughter, but as an intruder. Within 48 hours of the funeral, the real assault began. Evelyn had systematically cleared out my mother's private office, locking away every financial record, land title, and personal document. When I demanded to see my mother's will, Richard handed me a single typed page stating that my mother had disinherited me completely, leaving her entire multi-million-dollar estate to him and Evelyn. When I refused to sign the waiver relinquishing my rights, Richard's mask completely slipped. He launched a ruthless campaign to destroy my reputation before I could question the paperwork. He notified the local court that I was an imposter trying to shake down a grieving widow, filed police reports accusing me of stealing family property, and petitioned the judge to freeze all assets tied to my mother's name. He paraded through our town, painting me as a dishonorable daughter who had abandoned her family only to return out of pure greed. He believed that by attacking my integrity and burying me in legal fees, I would quietly surrender and walk away. The morning of the hearing, the county courthouse was packed with local observers, drawn in by the scandal Richard had spent weeks brewing. My father sat at the front, flanked by a team of high-priced attorneys he had hired using my mother's estate funds. Beside him, Evelyn sat with an icy, triumphant grin. When the proceedings began, Richard's lead counsel launched into a vicious opening statement. He presented fabricated affidavits claiming I had deserted the military years ago, lost my clearance, and was now illegally wearing a uniform to deceive the court into viewing me as a legitimate heir. He painted me as a manipulative fraud who had come home solely to extort my father during his period of grief. Every time the attorney leveled another accusation, Richard nodded along, occasionally feigning tearful outrage for the gallery. He demanded that the judge issue an immediate summary judgment stripping me of all estate claims, levying heavy fines, and referring me for criminal impersonation charges. Throughout the entire spectacle, I remained completely silent at the defense table. My attorney didn't interrupt, object, or engage in their theatrics. On the table between us rested a single, locked black briefcase. Richard kept glancing at it, his eyes filled with smug satisfaction. He mistook my calm for defeat, genuinely believing he had backed me into a corner with no escape. He was so consumed by his own narrative that he didn't notice the quiet entrance of two uniformed men taking their seats at the back of the courtroom. Just as Richard's lawyer concluded his opening remarks and demanded the judge sign the order, my attorney finally stood up. He didn't offer a lengthy speech or engage in heated arguments. Instead, he simply walked up to the bench carrying a sealed red envelope stamped with the official insignia of the Department of Defense and marked urgent/classified dispatch. A whisper rippled through the gallery as the courtroom door opened, and a uniformed military courier stepped inside, standing at attention beside our table. The judge paused, his expression shifting from routine impatience to sharp curiosity. He broke the military seal, pulled out the documents, and began reading the official order handed directly down from the Pentagon. With every line he scanned, the judge's posture changed. The calm, dismissive demeanor he had held all morning vanished, replaced by profound gravity. The dispatch contained full, unredacted confirmation of my 20 years of continuous high-clearance service, proving every single accusation Richard had made to be a complete lie. But more importantly, the Pentagon document revealed something Richard had tried desperately to hide. My mother had been part of a federal military trust that Richard had illegally attempted to liquidate 6 months before her passing. The judge slowly set the paper down, took off his glasses, and looked at Richard with an expression of cold, unyielding fury. The entire courtroom held its breath. The judge stood up from the bench, adjusted his robe, and said in a voice that cut through the silence like thunder, "Court is adjourned. Federal officers are waiting outside for you, Mr. Turner." The double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and 2 federal marshals marched down the center aisle, their boots heavy against the hardwood floor. Richard's face drained of all color, his smug composure completely shattering in an instant. Beside him, Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide with terror, as she scrambled to pull her purse off the table, realizing too late that their high-priced lawyers could no longer protect them. The judge leaned over the bench, his voice echoing through the silent room. He explained that the Pentagon dispatch didn't just clear my name, it exposed a massive, multi-state financial fraud scheme. By filing false sworn affidavits in a county court, Richard had inadvertently triggered an automatic federal audit of every document he had submitted over the last 5 years. The investigation revealed that Richard hadn't just tried to disinherit me. He had spent the last 6 months forged signing my late mother's signature to transfer her military pension benefits, federal trust assets, and real estate holdings into his private business accounts. He had even falsified tax records to hide the movement of millions of dollars across state lines. In his desperate greed to destroy my reputation and claim total victory, Richard had handed the federal government the exact paper trail they needed to prosecute him for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and military benefits theft. As the marshals placed handcuffs around my father's wrists, he looked back at me, his mouth opening and closing in complete shock, realizing that his own trap had finally snapped shut on him. 2 weeks after my father's arrest, the probate court officially threw out the fraudulent will, awarding me full control over my mother's estate, her properties, and the family business. Richard and Evelyn were formally indicted on multiple federal counts, facing years in prison and complete financial restitution. Standing in my mother's office, finally surrounded by her true belongings, I realized this victory wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about honoring her legacy and restoring the truth. With the recovered funds, I established the Margaret Turner Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and financial protection to military families facing domestic asset exploitation. My father tried to destroy me using greed and lies, but he forgot the most important lesson my mother ever taught me. Integrity always outlasts deceit. Now, I want to ask you who listened to my story. What would you have done if your own family turned against you like this? Comment your thoughts below, and let me know which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Don't forget to click the video on your screen right now for another incredible story that will leave you completely speechless. Thank you for watching.